Hey everybody. Yesterday I made a video about what would have to happen for Vice President Harris to win the election. So today I wanted to talk about what would need to happen for Donald Trump, or kind of what the likely landscape of a Trump win would look like. And kind of as a background point, I travel some internationally, and it's always interesting when I meet people from overseas who will ask me to explain the Trump phenomenon. And it's, kind of a cottage industry over the last 8 years, where typically it has reporters going to some diner in New Hampshire or something, or Iowa, talking to, a blue collar white voter. And so a lot of what I'm going to talk about here kind of has this psychological component, because I think that so much of the Trump phenomenon requires you to view the world kind of through, or politics through, a psychological lens. So here are my 5 reasons why Donald Trump will win the election. And for what it's worth, this is the position that I'm in. I don't want him to win, but I think he will win the election. So the first one is that I think people have intentionally and aggressively decided to forget about COVID. 2020 is, I don't know, the best way that you can describe it is almost like if you have a magnet, with 2 positive poles, like the moment that people talk about COVID, people just want to poof, shoot away. And it's a fascinating phenomenon. I remember during COVID reading the book about the flu pandemic, and one of the really striking things is one of the later chapters was talking about how quickly people just moved on with their lives. And we know this because it was really like a historical moment that most people up until COVID didn't even really know was something that happened. It killed more people than World War I, right? But there is something about that experience that was so traumatic for everybody that we don't like to revisit it. And so some of the worst aspects of the Trump administration ended up being his handling of COVID. But I don't think that people have really attempted to make that a key part of prosecuting the case against him. And I think part of it is just an acknowledgement of that it's almost like people have amnesia about it. And it's not something that we're willing to engage on a substantive level about. And it's this collective COVID amnesia that I think plays a big part in people's willingness to misremember the 4 years of the Trump presidency. Second thing is, for all the kind of tumult and talk in the news about how it's a new race and everything is new, and Kamala Harris has injected a new excitement into the race and all these things, it's actually a pretty frozen race. And it has been certainly since last October, right, where just there's this small but steady Trump lead in every single poll. It rarely gets more than 4 points, and it's usually around 2 points. And the polling is early for a Harris-Trump race, but it seems that the basic dynamic in terms of the overall number is the same. Like some of the underlying, the crosstabs are a little bit different, like maybe a little bit higher with Hispanics, a little bit lower with whites, etc. But the basic number is the same. And in fact, if you think about the Donald Trump phenomenon, he seems to be kind of anchored with like a rubber band at like 46.5%. So there are times when he will drop low, but he always pulls right back up. He will occasionally go a little bit higher, but if you look at the elections, when he ran against Hillary Clinton, I think he was at 46.2 or something like that. And he won. He didn't get the popular vote, but he won the Electoral College. Against Joe Biden, he actually did slightly better in terms of a percentage of the vote. I think he had 46.8, something like that. And if you look at his polling, both now and against Biden, it was about 46.5%. And so it's almost like you can just, if you're the Harris campaign, just throw out the actual like plus minus and just look at what her number is and say, like, we just got to get to probably about 49%, given what the Electoral College does, to how votes are distributed if you want to win. Because Trump, almost irrespective of what he does, it just feels like he's going to be at 46.5%. Like that's just where he is. And it's very exciting, and it will sell ad space at newspapers for people to pitch this as a really dynamic race, but it's probably not. It is trench warfare over a pretty narrow band of voters, and it will be about whether or not Harris can get from 45 to about 49%, which is a huge undertaking. And it'll be a difficult one for her. The third thing is, can Harris sell the American public on the country's actual economic strength? By almost every economic indicator, the United States is in a fantastic place. And a lot of that credit is due to the Biden administration, or the Biden-Harris administration, as she would say, their stewardship of the economy. It was unprecedented in the set of challenges that Biden faced coming out of COVID, in a really kind of literal way, which is that no one really knew how to restart an economy after you had stopped it. And so the fact that we're going to have this soft landing is pretty remarkable. And in fact, it's probably better than the best case scenarios of most economists. Now, the obvious point is that the one area where the landing hasn't been soft is maybe the one area where people care the most, which is inflation. And it is difficult to tell people that overall things are really great. And especially when you remember 2020, that things are really great, when what they know is that their groceries cost more. And that is a real thing. And so that is a challenge. And so, a lot of times people say, well, you can't really convince people or tell people that they're better off than they are. This is James Carville's point, that if people feel like the economy is bad, you can't tell them otherwise. There is some truth to that, but I do also think that there is a persuasive process of campaigns. And if you are an effective communicator and you focus on this, right, it's a bit like boxing. You've got to go to the body for a long time before you get to the championship rounds. You've got to dedicate time and commitment to making the case. And I think that she has to do this, since so much of every election is ultimately a referendum on how people feel about the economy. And because of his previous branding, Trump naturally brings a public perception strength in that area. So you have to commit to trying to convince the American public that the economy is strong. The fourth is that Trump will win if Chicago is a mess. And I think this was probably more likely when Biden was the nominee. It seemed like, especially with the Palestine protesters, that they were going to make a ruckus at the DNC. It remains to be seen if that's the case. These protesters are nothing if they're not uniquely capable of making themselves annoying. Whether or not or however you think about their cause, like, they don't play along, right? And so it may end up being the case that Chicago could be a tumultuous scene, which is not what the Democrats want. My guess is that this won't be an issue, but I would wait to see kind of how the Chicago convention plays out. Obviously, people have visions of 1968 in their mind and how that disastrous convention ended up helping Richard Nixon. And lastly, the fifth thing is, I think that Trump wins if the culture, race, and gender wars don't quite play out the way that Democrats and the media think. Now, like most people on my side of the aisle, I think J.D. Vance has come across as really weird. But it's also the case that I don't know that that is how the voters who will ultimately decide the election feel about him. That there is a way that if the Republicans are savvy, they can turn the Democratic attacks on him into attacks against what they perceive as kind of traditional American family values. That, what he supports is families having more children, and that Democrats don't want that, whatever. There's a way that you can spin this that ends up not being helpful to Democrats. And in the same way, I am very interested to see how Harris's spin on the racial question ends up going. And the obvious comparison is in 2008. 2008 with Obama is different because it's always going to be different when you're the first who does something. And as the first legitimate candidate for president, Obama made what I think was a tactically smart decision to mostly ignore race as like a central animating question or idea of his candidacy. He didn't have to frequently reference this because it was kind of obvious, right? Like, he's a brown guy who's showing up on your screen. Harris has leaned more into the identity politics aspects of this race. And so you'll hear a lot about some of these organizing calls and things that are specifically like, 40,000 black women, or black men supporting Harris, or there's even a white men supporting Harris. That she's viewing this, or she's approaching this, Harris is approaching kind of organizing and branding of the election as explicitly more in line with how Democrats think about and talk about race and identity than maybe how the general public does. And it's still not clear to me, and in fact I doubt a little bit, whether or not it is wise to run saying I'm a black person running for president, as opposed to I'm running for president and I happen to be black, which is kind of more what Obama did. The racial dynamics they're quite different than they were when Obama ran. And if you want to understand that, go back and listen to or read the speech that he gave about race when the Jeremiah Wright stuff was going on. And you read, and the sense that you'll get is just how out of step it is with how progressives think about race today. And so it's always a fraught topic, and whether or not she handles it with adeptness remains to be seen. But more than that, it's not clear that how she is choosing to handle it is how everyday Americans want to think about race vis-a-vis the presidency. And the same is true with gender politics, and the same, I think, is true overall with kind of cultural issues. Because, as I said before, like, this is ultimately going to be decided by, suburban white women in Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Milwaukee, Detroit, and maybe Minneapolis. So those are the 5 reasons why I think Trump can ultimately win this race. My guess is that right now the betting is something like 2-1 that Trump will win. It's incredibly tight margins, and despite all the different back and forth, it's ultimately going to come down to, on election night, we're going to be watching the same 6 cities, suburbs and exurbs, and turn out there. Right? That's the whole game. And so for the last 3 elections is basically the same. All right. I'll see you guys tomorrow.